the activity of the SURJ Legislative Team. We support policy proposals advocated for by our BIPOC-led organizations, Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations. We organize primarily white people, but not solely, within our respective city, state, and federal legislative districts. We take targeted actions at multiple levels, and we act with intention. This is important, to act with intention, but always to act. Definitely one of the guiding principles there. And now John Smeaton, who's another member of the Baltimore Legislative Team, is going to talk again very briefly about the Maryland General Assembly's process.
Howdy, folks. Can you all hear me? Or I guess, Barbara, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So howdy, my name is John, and I'm a member of SURJ Baltimore's Legislative Team. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the Maryland General Assembly so you can understand how we devise our strategy for pushing the legislation of our accountability partners. So the Maryland General Assembly is the state's legislative body, just like the House and the Senate are the legislative bodies for the federal government. It's composed of two similar bodies, the Maryland House, similarly named bodies, the Maryland House of Delegates and the Maryland Senate. The Maryland House and Senate are scheduled to only really meet for 3 months of the year. And in the case of this year, that's January 13th through April 12th. So we're already in the middle of the session. After the session is over, there is a full reset on any past legislation, which basically means that any bills that become law must be born and passed in that very short 3-month time frame. As a Maryland resident, you're represented by 1 senator and 1 to 3 delegates. I say 1 to 3 delegates because some folks whose districts end in the letter A or B might have 1 to 2 delegates, whereas the majority of us probably have 3 delegates. Each of your legislators is part of what's called a standing committee. These are committees that hold public hearings on bills related to certain issues like the environment, courts, the state budget, and other things. And basically what you kind of imagine when people are testifying and talking about bills, a lot of that is happening in these standing committees. Based on their standing committee, your legislator might have a unique influence on certain issue areas because each committee is committed to a certain area and your legislator is only assigned to one of those committees. For a bill to become law, it has to make it through both the House and the Senate using the same exact process, but it has to be in sequence. So the bill can't be considered in both the House and the Senate at the same time. It has to make it through the House and then make it through the Senate. This process includes a public hearing where folks can submit written or oral testimony. Then the committee votes on the bill and amendments are considered and voted on by both the committee and the full body of the House or the Senate. These amendments can ultimately significantly alter the meaning of bills. And so it's very important that we as constituents are aware of them and try to stop the worst ones from happening and make the good ones occur. After this, the body will vote on a finalized version of this bill, which requires a majority of that body to approve it to pass. Once passed in the House or the Senate, as I said before, the bill has to do the same process again in their respective legislative counterparts. And once it's been passed by both the House and the Senate, the bill is then sent to the governor's desk where he can sign it into law or choose to veto it, which basically means he doesn't approve it. If he chooses to veto it, then a 3/5 supermajority of the House and the Senate must pass the bill for it to become law. Note at the bottom, I have a picture of the Senate and the House makeup where blue represents Democrats, red represents Republicans. And what you can see here is that we actually have supermajorities of Democrats in both the Senate and the House of Delegates. What that means is that you can pass any bill you'd like in these bodies without the approval of a single Republican. It also means that if any bill fails to pass in any of these bodies, it's because a majority of Republicans or Democrats did not approve it. I'm sorry, a majority, it's because the Democrats didn't unanimously approve it, I should say. So, some powerful people that we try to target in our work in the legislature include the Senate President and the Speaker of the House. That's Senate President Ferguson, who's from District 46 in Baltimore, and Speaker of the House Adrian Jones. They both are powerful because as Speaker and President, they're able to dictate a lot of the agenda of these bodies and also make assignments to the standing committees I talked about. And these assignments are called chairmanships. So you have a chair and a vice chair. These 10 major standing committee chairs hold a lot of power because they can choose how bills are heard in their committee, when they're voted on, if they're voted on, and as a result, they basically have power to unilaterally sometimes stop certain legislation from making it through even if they're approved by the majority of other folks. And some notable folks in these bodies from Baltimore City specifically include Luke Klippinger from District 46, who's the chair of what's called the Judiciary Committee in the House, as well as Maggie McIntosh from District 43, who is the chair or the chair of the Appropriations Committee, which determines a lot of the budgetary issues in the city. In addition to this, the city has a group of folks called the City Delegation. These are individuals who are from Baltimore City specifically, basically all of them all together, and they vote on issues specific to Baltimore City. And generally what happens is if an issue affects only Baltimore, they'll make a vote on it and the rest of the legislative body will defer to their vote in deciding whether to support or be against it. So they also hold a lot of power, and the chairs of those committees include Corey McCrae and Stephanie Smith, both from District 45. So some main takeaways here. The reason I tell you this is because it informs our strategies for how we push our legislators. The main takeaways include, depending on where you live, the legislators that represent you can actually have unique and specific powers to affect legislation. And so we need to target certain folks in certain districts based on that. In addition, action has to happen in this very small window from January 13th through April 12th, because anything that we want to do after April 13th has to wait all the way till the next year for it to even be considered. And finally, that SURJ is here. The purpose for SURJ is to help folks navigate this very complicated process. And now Barbara's going to tell you a little bit about how we do that.
Yes. So one of the ways in which we try to pressure or prod certain legislators are through email action alerts. These are set up, the SURJ Legislative Team actually sets these up. So you'll receive an email. It takes about 1 to 2 minutes to complete, and it will automatically send emails to your state representatives and any relevant committee chairs. It includes a customizable email template. It'll be drafted by the legislative team or another work group. And then once you've taken the 1 to 2 minutes to submit this, you'll get an email confirmation that your letters were delivered, and you'll also get a call script so you can follow up by phone. As well as any relevant contact information of the legislators that you're trying to target, and a link to report the stance of your legislators. Tracking the responses of our legislators is another big important thing that we do, so we can know which ones to lean on a little harder. Another one of the ways that we put pressure on certain legislators is the work that the Baltimore Testimony Team does. The testimony team is a group of folks who have kind of volunteered for this, so you're not stuck with it if you don't want to, but folks who've kind of stepped up to do this job. You'll get an email 2 to 3 days a week during the session. Emails come in about 10:30 on days that the testimony is due. Testimony refers to written testimony, which is important to submit for bills that have hearings coming up. Testimony is only accepted between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. on one day, that is 2 business days before the day of the hearing. The testimony team will come up with template testimony and guidance. You'll have places where you can plug in personal information, add personal stories or anecdotes or research that you have to kind of, improve the case. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to submit written testimony. It's very, very easy. I'm not a tech savvy person, but I've managed to do it several times this session already. So I promise it's very easy. And the testimony team also provides guidance for oral testimony, which can be another really important thing at bill hearings. Now we're going to find our legislative districts. There is a link that will show up in the chat momentarily. If you can click that link, it'll take you to a website. You'll plug in your residence, your address, and it'll let you know what your legislative district is. Make sure to look for your legislative, not your congressional. So we're looking at the state legislative districts. Minus 43, you can see it in my little Zoom name if you want to add yours as well. Some other legislation specific and district specific actions we do. This is all based on the needs of our partners and what would be most strategic for that district. So here's a couple other actions that districts have done, but it's not a one size fits all kind of thing for each district. Another really important thing tonight is that we make sure to pay our speakers for their time and raise some funds for their organizations, all of which are doing amazing, amazing work. If you're able to donate any amount, what we'd really like to be able to do is raise at least $400 tonight so we can split that among the 4 partner groups that have come to speak. And again, any amount is wonderful. And this is just a reminder about the closed captioning, if you need that. And now to the meat of the evening. These are our first speakers, Nicole Hansen, who is the Executive Director of Out for Justice, and along with her, Christopher Dews, who's a policy advocate for the Job Opportunities Task Force. So I'm gonna let them take it away.
Thank you, SURJ, for your continued support. I see so many familiar faces. Melissa, and Sandy, who are, you know, some of my favorite original SURJ members. And I just want to, you know, take a few seconds to give honor to, you know, one of our late elders, Betty Robinson, who I adore and who I hope you all are studying her work. I hope you all are studying the things that she said. I hope that you're playing back the videos. I just, you know, it is my hope that, you know, SURJ Baltimore will really stand in her honor and stand in her ideals of how she, you know, envisioned this world looking like, and how folks could become our allies and maintain the allyship. And so I'm just honored to be here tonight. I want to alert the attendees that I will be giving some of my time to Mr. Christopher Dews, who is, I'm allowed to admit people. Do y'all know that? You should want me admitting people or choosing not to.
We can take care of that part.
I don't mind helping. Y'all help me a lot. So yeah, because the Job Opportunities Task Force are Out for Justice original partners. You know, this was a partnership that developed way before I became executive director of Out for Justice. It was a partnership. It's a mutually beneficial relationship, and I have no problem sharing my time. What I want to talk about, and make sure y'all, am I able to see my time that I have, or y'all gonna like give me a alert or something when I go over? Okay. Thanks, David. So Out for Justice, you know, I want, for the sake of time, I want to talk about 2 veto overrides, and I'm sure Chris may expound on this too. And you know, I want to talk about the 2 veto overrides, and hopefully, if I have enough time, to talk about one important bill that is very important in this legislative session, and we cannot lose focus. One is the Women's Pre-Release Facility, the Gender Responsive Act. And what this bill is it says that not only are women important in Maryland, but it says that women coming home from our in jails are also important. And it will require that the state show that women coming home from our prisons or jails are important by ensuring that we no longer wait another decade to make sure that women coming home from our prisons and jails have a standalone pre-release center that encompasses all of the services that our women need to be productive members of society, all of the services that our women need to ensure that they are keeping their community safe and to ensure that they're keeping their children safe, right? And so what pre-release is, it is a status. When you are within 18 months of your release, you are supposed to be eligible to re-engage with your family. You're supposed to be eligible to re-engage with society. You're supposed to learn the transit system. You're supposed to get access to 21st century jobs. You're supposed to start learning the internet, because that is the way of the world, right? And what we're finding and what we know is that women do not have that. We know that the majority of our women that is housed at the MCIW are women who are convicted on nonviolent offenses, right? And even if they were, they deserve an adequate pre-release facility to come home to. We know that women are the primary caretakers of their families. We know that they were the primary caretakers when they went in, and they will likely be the primary caretakers when they come home, right? We know that our state spends billions of dollars. In fact, our country spends upward of $500 billion or so to support child poverty. We know that when our women are incarcerated, their children are relocated, their children are pushed into foster care systems, and all of the money that this state is spending on foster care, we could save that money by ensuring that our women are safe when they come home from our prisons and jails, and that our women are getting trauma-informed care, they're getting gender-responsive care. And so I urge you to continue to reach out to your legislators. We have over 40 organizations standing in support with us on this veto override. We have over 360 individual people who signed on to our sign-on letter. We have, the legislators has spoken in 2020, and they passed this legislation, right? This legislation was passed, yet Governor Hogan vetoed this bill based off of money, and money should not be the determining factor of why women do not get what they need and what the Department of Corrections is required to do under the law. The other veto override that I'll talk about is the unit rule, right? This is a rule that impacts Marylanders across the state that have a criminal record. What we know is in a place like Baltimore in particular, when you are locked up at the time of the police interaction, oftentimes brown and black individuals are subjected to a host of charges. They don't just get one charge, they get 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 charges. And we call that in the streets overcharging. If I got caught shoplifting, why do I go to central booking with 7 other charges? Failure to disobey. It's all these tacked on offenses. And what happens is, for people to avoid jail time, the state will say, hey, if you plead guilty to one of these 5 charges, we will dismiss the other charges. And typically people think, okay, if these charges are dismissed, then they're eligible for expungement, because the current law says that dismissals, acquittals, and the like are eligible for expungement. But I would alert you all that if one pleads guilty to one of the charges in that lump, none of those charges are eligible for expungement. And so what that means is, even when the legislature introduced more expungement laws, we're hearing about expungement of marijuana convictions, right, as we go into legalization. We're hearing expungement of new offenses, but without removing the unit rule, none of those expungement laws benefit Marylanders, right? And so we need to make sure that we're contacting our lawmakers to also override that veto, right? Because if we want people to transition into jobs, we want people to be able to afford housing, we want people to be productive, then we can no longer continue to keep this law on the books, which is a prosecutorial tool that's used when prosecutors cannot, they don't have the evidence to find us guilty. But they use this rule, this tool, to keep these things on our record. The other issue that I will highlight is the Value My Vote Act. And if any of you all are following Out for Justice and Partners over this last primary and general election, you know that we did some phenomenal work, right? And this was work on the back of the 2016 legislation that allowed over 40,000 individuals with criminal records to have access to the ballot, right? That this allowed the people who were still on probation or parole to have the right to vote. But more importantly, our individuals sitting in our pretrial facilities, our jails, our individuals who had not yet been convicted of anything had the right to vote. And in addition to that, individuals with misdemeanors had the right to vote. But the advocates had to come back in 2018 and expand the ballot, right? Because we realized that while the 2016 legislation was good, we needed to expand the rights of these individuals. And then we also needed to educate community, because even though the 26th law had passed, there was nothing really done on the behalf of the state to ensure that people were educated about this new law. And so it forced the nonprofit sector and the organizations, a part of the Expand the Ballot Coalition, to really fill in the gaps, right? To make sure that probation and parole officers knew that people can vote, make sure people knew that they can vote, make sure that we went inside of our jails in the middle of a pandemic to ensure that individuals could vote pre-trial, that we looked at the Department of Corrections voting plan that popped up in the middle of the night and said, hey, where are the safeguards? Where are the protections for our folks on the inside? Where is the accountability? How are you working with the State Board of Election? And so during that general election, what we were able to do at Out for Justice and our partners was we was able to show the importance of passing legislation. And the component to that is implementation. We'll hear a lot about legislation being introduced, but rarely do we talk about and require of our legislators to ensure that implementation in their bills exists, right? That they think about how the agencies and the organizations who's responsible for making sure these laws happen are doing its job. And that is what we found in 2020 was not happening. The State Board of Elections had never went inside the facility to ensure voting access. And because Out for Justice, Maryland Justice Project, Life After Release, Job Opportunities Task Force, ACLU, and Common Cause, what we did was we got on that coalition, we got on that work group with the State Board of Election and demanded that they pay attention to these eligible voters, because the job of the State Board is to ensure voter access for all voters, and not just the ones that are free, and not just the ones that don't have a criminal record. And so what we were able to do, y'all, was historic. And it's in the State Board of Elections 2020 report. Under the highlights, it talks about the partnership with Out for Justice and the partnership with the NAACP, where for the first time in their history, they ensured information got into the prisons. And we, in fact, had to draft the documents, the very packets that the State Board of Elections took into the local jails across the state was developed by Out for Justice, right? That we had the partnership of the Howard County and Carroll County detention centers. We had wardens on our side, that we were making sure that the State Board of Elections received the list of eligible voters in our prisons and jails. And so what that did was we were able to come back this session and really add to the legislation that we introduced last year. But we added to it because we had the support of the State Board, we had the insight of the directly impacted, and we had the support of the other advocates across the state. And I would argue that that is the best type of legislation. When legislation has been battle tested, it has been experimented, it has been implemented, that is the legislation we want to get behind. And so we want folks to show up for House Bill 222, because that is the preferred voting bill. That is the preferred bill that is sanctioned and that is supported by the directly impacted individuals in our prisons and jails, by the directly impacted individuals in the state of Maryland, who says that we want legislation that is not only popular, but we want legislation that has teeth, that has some backbone, that has some level of accountability and implementation.
I take it I'm next. Thank you so much, Nicole, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction there. I do want to say that I did put in the chat the Value My Vote Act that Nicole is talking about. It is House Bill 222, and there's going to be a Senate hearing, I believe, next week on the 4th. Thank you. They're doing phenomenal work on that end, and I guess I'll pick it up from there. So JOTF, let me start with my name. I'm Christopher Dews. I'm a policy advocate for the Job Opportunities Task Force. And we work to ensure that lower wage workers have access to higher wage jobs. And the way that we do this is mostly through policy advocacy, and specifically through policies that decriminalize poverty and race. And so what I'm going to go through very briskly with the rest of the people on this call tonight is what those policies are and how we're going to go after that. Wonderfully, a lot of these policies are already listed on this sheet. I was not prepped for that, but thank you so much for being so ahead of the game. So the first thing that we're looking at is paid sick leave expansion. Both 1199 SEIU and the Public Justice Center are coming together on two separate bills, actually. One is called the Maryland Essential Workers Protection Act, and the other one is literally just Maryland Healthy Working Families Act expansion. And they both have similar veins, but they do similar things. They specifically focus on ensuring that essential workers, or those deemed essential, however one wants to define that terminology, have access to paid sick leave, have access to hazard pay, have access to the right to refuse work in dangerous conditions, have the right to have access to the employer's emergency workforce plan for how do we deal with pandemics and things of that nature. So what this bill would simply do is allow for, during public health emergencies, that essential workers would be protected and have protections, hazard pay and things of that nature for their work. And I will put those bill numbers into the chat as I go through the rest of these. And of course, the reason why the racial aspect of that is that the vast majority of essential workers who do the cleaning, who do the transportations and things of that nature happen to be people of color. So we really want to make sure that in a pandemic, historically, people who share my skin tone are the ones that get hit the hardest. And we're seeing that all over the place right now in Baltimore and Maryland, that disproportionately those who are Black and brown are suffering and dying from the coronavirus at higher rates than people of a lighter skin tone. So that's the paid sick leave expansion. We're pushing legislation on that. Diminution credits. What this bill would do is it ensures that people that are incarcerated, who are going to be released, get themselves educated. And what this bill specifically would do is it would give a 90-day diminution credit. What that means is 90 days off of a person's sentence if they complete a vocational certification, high school diploma, or college degree. So basically, if they get themselves educated while they are incarcerated and they come out, they now have a skill and they get a reward for doing that. Right now, the current law states that you can get 30 days for taking a class, but there's no reward for finishing a class. And as we all know, in the state of Maryland, 30% of the population is African American, but 70% of the incarcerated community is actually Black. So the more people that we can get educated, there's going to be a disproportionate amount of racial equity that can come from that if we pass that piece of legislation. Budgeting and monitoring. JLTF is always about monitoring the budget and ensuring that specifically the EARN grant. The EARN grant is called the Employment Advancement Right Now Act. And it was a compact that was brought together by employers, legislators, and activists and advocates to ensure that as we move into different communities and different economies, for example, with solar power, oh my God, so many different industries, the tech industry, solar industries, different, where there's skills gaps, where basically there are people who, where the jobs are, but there's not enough trained people to handle those jobs. The Employment Advancement Right Now Act goes to training people for those positions, specifically for Black and brown communities. So that way, as these positions open up and take over, that people that are disproportionately marginalized are given access to those opportunities. That's the EARN grant. We're going to make sure that investments in the skills training and stuff like that happens. And I know I talk very fast. I'm going to put in the chat a link to every bill that I'm talking about so you can look them up for yourself. The next bill I want to talk about, and this one is huge. This is GPS monitoring. We want to ensure that indigency determinations are taken into account when looking into GPS monitoring. GPS monitoring is also referred to as the box, the ankle bracelet. You probably have seen people with an ankle bracelet and it monitors your location. Basically, you're on home detention, so you are technically supposed to be under arrest or still incarcerated, but they give you the freedom to go home. This was huge during the pandemic because, of course, we wanted to depopulate prisons. That was seen as a great, humane way of looking at life. What was not taken into account was the fact that those electronic monitoring devices, those ankle bracelets, are not given to these individuals for free. So for example, suppose I am picked up on a charge and they say, well, Chris, you have the opportunity at my bail review, the opportunity to wait in jail for 3 months until your charge is heard, till your case is heard, or go home. The vast majority of people would choose to go home because why would you want to stay in an unsanitized cell? However, GPS monitoring companies, specifically private home detention monitoring agencies, charge $10 to $20 a day, depending on which jurisdiction you live in the state of Maryland, for that service. Roughly, that can be $300 or more. I was just on a call with a gentleman today who is paying $364 a month for his grandson's ankle bracelet. And if he does not pay, to be clear, if he does not pay, his grandson will go back to jail and have to wait in a in a jail until his trial is heard. So what this bill would do is it would ensure that if you count as indigent, I believe 200% at the federal poverty line, that the state who incarcerated you will have to pay those GPS monitoring costs. Of course, if you are picking up more Black and brown people, thanks to racial profiling, whether a person is found guilty or not, specifically, we're focusing on pretrial. So you have not even been found guilty. We want to ensure that these GPS monitoring companies are not just, extorting Black and brown bodies while they wait for trial. Because I don't know about you, but $364 a month seems like a lot of money to give away to a GPS monitoring company. And we passed a court rule in 2017 that says that nobody should have to pay for their freedom. So that is Senate Bill 23. We have a hearing for that, I want to say next Wednesday, and House Bill 316 with Delegate Stephanie Smith, who is, of course, the chairwoman for the Baltimore City delegation and District 45. Moving right along, and I know that, oh my goodness, let me finish this up then. I'll make these two final points. We're trying to pass a bill that focuses on eliminating criminal justice debts and incarcerations, including GPS monitoring fines. We're also trying to eliminate the use of credit history in auto insurance rates disproportionately. Newer workers and workers with no credit have to pay at least 123% higher in their auto insurance rates. We want to get rid of that. And last but not least, we want to eliminate the rules that say that you cannot automatically expunge non-conviction. So even if you're not found guilty, you still have a criminal record. That's a problem for us because, of course, you're innocent until proven guilty, unless you live in the state of Maryland where you are guilty even if you are proven innocent. I could go into a lot more. I'm just going to drop that information into the chat. But thank you all for listening. Decriminalizing Poverty and Race. I'm Christopher Dews, and I'm with the Job Opportunities Task Force. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. That is a ton of information that you just fit into 20 minutes. So, I mean, and I know there's more, but that's incredible. Thank you so much for that awesome information. Next, we have Samuel Jordan, who's the president of the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition. BTEC is how you'll often hear about that, and I'll let Samuel take it away.
Join you here this evening with all the members and supporters of SURJ. Very glad to hear again the discussion from Nicole and from Christopher. And I want to make this clear from the beginning that the clients, the patrons, those who are assisted by Nicole and Christopher, for the most part, are the same people for whom we are most concerned. And we want to refer to a concept in the law that gives the context for the single bill that I will discuss this evening. In the law, and frankly, in the post-Civil War constitutional amendments, there's a term called protected classes. Protected classes under federal law are most often applied to people who can be distinguished by race, by their ethnicity, by their national origin. Other categories have been added since. But essentially, what I want to make absolutely clear is that before the laws were passed, before the amendments were confirmed and affirmed in the Constitution, and since, the protected classes have never been protected. The protected classes, in our case, we want to refer to the residents of Baltimore region, particularly those who are from low-income households and communities, those who are transit riders, Black communities particularly, people of color, and frankly, all of goodwill. But the protected classes are those about whom we're concerned this evening. Our bill that I want to speak about tonight is called the Transportation Equity Analyses, plural, and Assurances Act of 2021. BTEC was fortunate to find in Delegate Sheila Ruth a champion of equality under law, of equal protection under the law. So our bill is historic in the sense that it is the very first time that the state has actually and will be asked to consider a bill that gives protections to people who might well be adversely and disproportionately adversely impacted by the actions, policies, programs, services taken, implemented, executed by the Maryland Department of Transportation, and particularly the Maryland Transit Administration, or what we know as MTA. This bill arises out of necessity, frankly. On September 1, MTA proposed a most draconian bill, in fact, never seen before in the history of the state of Maryland. The bill was an attempt, or at least proposed, to be a solution to budget for shortfalls in MTA and in Maryland's government generally. We never got clear answers. MTA never made any real information clear to us on this issue. What did happen, though, and what was proposed, draconian cuts that I referred to, meant 12 lines, 12 routes in the core bus service being extended or reduced in their service, which usually means longer headways, distances between the buses as they arrive at a bus stop. 25 routes were scheduled and proposed for elimination. The cuts would have amounted to 20% in the services in the core bus service. A core bus service in MTA has 83% Black ridership. That was 20% of the cuts for MTA, being borne by the core bus service, which is critical to over 270,000 people every day in the Baltimore region, majority of whom are Black, people of color, low income, and people who are frankly transit reliant. What this bill would do is change the way we look at the word transit equity and equity analyses. Instead of trying to hammer MTA after the fact and insist that they make some corrections in their policies or programs, this bill seeks to do something I really want to emphasize. The bill itself promotes an approach to equity, an approach to equity that recommends anticipation and prevention rather than a reliance upon recovery and correction, the old strategies. Recovery and correction, by definition, as you would assume, means after the fact. Delegate Ruth and BTEC agreed that what we needed were protections of that class adversely, disproportionately affected before the fact. So if nothing else resonates in my discussion tonight, it is that the Transit Equity Analyses and Assurances Act of 2021 seeks to make equity an issue and is addressed before the fact, not after. Now, what would that mean? Well, it would mean, one, that we look at not only the core bus service, but what about the other modal divisions? For example, while the 83% Black core bus service was to take 20% of the cuts, the commuter rail, or MARC, would take only 4 to 8% cuts. Commuter bus, only 5 to 7% cuts. That was the story. 20% of the core bus service, 83% Black, 8% cuts in the commuter rail MARC service, which is 76% white. Nothing else could be clearer. If you look at the way we're trying to look at it, we know that we need, in this case, MTA to honor another approach to transit equity. In fact, they never did do what their own guidelines on Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act require, which is prior analysis. Well, this bill, for the first time, takes that responsibility for enforcement from the federal level to the state level. For the first time with the passage of this bill, now we're still in DLS, in the, excuse me, legislative services, to finish the text and language and get a bill number. Delegate Ruth expects that we'll have a bill drop by February 5 and a number, and we'll begin the round of hearings and additional advocacy, of course. But in the meantime, The bill requires prior analyses of, one, the communities, the protected classes who are most adversely and disproportionately impacted by the cuts. MDOT/MTA made no such study available and made no such attempt to conduct such an analysis. A second analysis is a cost-benefit analysis. Where do the burdens fall? Where do the benefits fall? Are they equitably distributed? The third matter is a matter of consultation. MDOT has not conducted any consultation with the members and ladies of the communities most directly affected. My time is up, and I will ask that all members and supporters of SURJ, who've always been very supportive of our work at BTEC, that you look for our announcements on the Transportation Equity Analyses and Assurances Act of 2021. Thank you so much.
That time really does go fast, doesn't it?
It flew by. Was it 3 minutes or 2 minutes?
Thank you so much for distilling that amount of complex information into something so bite-sized and educational. It really is, someone mentioned in the chat, a huge bill. So thank you very much. Next, we're revisiting the How to Find Your Legislators if you haven't done so already. Hopefully someone can drop that link in the chat. Next, we have Trey Murphy. He is the Director of Programs and Strategy with Organizing Black. They also work with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability, and the Campaign for Justice, Safety, and Jobs are two organizations, two coalitions that have a bunch of members, a bunch of other organizations that are members. Organizing Black is a member of both of those. CJSJ is a citywide coalition for police accountability. MCJPA is the statewide coalition. And I do want to take a minute just to highlight their new website, which has some great information there. Hopefully someone can drop that in the chat for me as well. So Trey, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thank you to, can you all hear me? Sometimes my computer, okay, great. Sometimes my computer doesn't work. I honestly need to get a new one. Yeah, thank you all for having me. And really shout out to all of the folks who have already presented, because I think that what we are really talking about in all of these issues is the difference in how people are treated, people of color compared to you know, people who are not people of color, particularly white people. And so all of these are racialized issues. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about police accountability and where we're at and where we need to go for this coming legislative session. So as folks may be aware of, one of the hot topics when it comes to particularly Black people, particularly in Baltimore City, is the way in which police disproportionately target and brutalize and even murder Black people and people of color in Baltimore City. I think that we saw on full display the differences of treatment when it comes to Black people and people of color compared to white people with the January 6th attempted coup in the nation's capital, where literally white people can storm the nation's capital and essentially walk right back out the door after completely overturning that building and making threats to some of the most highly secured people in the world, and still walk out without any scars, right? And so now we find ourselves particularly in Baltimore City in the state where that is not the case for communities of color. We cannot essentially challenge people in positions of power and walk away unscathed. And so to that same vein, for years now, Black people in the city of Baltimore and people of color throughout the state of Maryland have been brutalized by the police and the police have escaped accountability because of the laws that essentially shield them and protect them from any level of accountability and any level of sort of reconciliation. So we have 5 priorities that are part of the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability, as well as CJSJ, the Campaign for Justice, Safety, and Jobs. The first and biggest one is the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. So people may or may not be aware that Maryland was the first state in the country to actually pass a law enforcement officer bill of rights that gave police the ability to escape any accountability. They gave them additional rights beyond what you would traditionally get as a everyday quote unquote citizen or community member, and it allowed them essentially to escape any level of accountability when they do any type of wrongdoings or misconduct. So some of the things that are in the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights include things such as you can't be questioned for a certain time period. An officer, if they are alleged of a crime, they get anywhere between 7 or more days before they can actually be questioned by another sworn police officer. Now I can tell you that if I go and break into somebody's house or shoot somebody today, I'm going to be sitting in jail tonight, right? And so that's just a little bit of the contrast. But if a police officer does that, it doesn't matter. You know, if it is caught on video or any of those things, they still have 7 days before they can be questioned. And so what we're saying is that that policies like that are egregious, and they have to be removed from the books. And so this year we are working both in the House and the Senate to repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. That bill number in the House is HB 151. I believe it's sponsored by Delegate. I cannot remember who the House sponsor, or at least how to say the House sponsor's name. Starts with an A. But in the Senate, it is also being sponsored by Jill Carter. And we are told that both chambers one of the hardest bills to get past this legislative session, because there's so many politics involved with this bill. And so we want to show a united force and show legislators that this should be the year for police transparency, and that police transparency and police accountability cannot happen without MPIA being fully implemented. The third thing is to set a state statutory limit on police use of force. So right now, there's no uniform statewide statute that essentially limits use of force in any case. And what that oftentimes means is that most of the time, a police officer can brutalize a person and use excessive force, even when a person is not showing any signs of escalation. Even if a community member is not showing any signs of escalation, police officers can use excessive force and get away with it, because there's no standard that says that this is where there's no standard that says that this is in these circumstances use of force can happen versus in these circumstances use of force cannot happen, right? And so what we are actually advocating for is that there should be some statewide standard. If somebody is simply walking down the street, a police officer should not be allowed to throw that person to the ground, smash their head on the concrete, and then say, oops, well, there's no use of force standard, right? We actually have to have some type of regulation on the ways in which police actually use of force, and when is those times appropriate, right? When are those times actually appropriate for police officers to use of force, and what is the repercussions if they do engage in use of force? in instances where they should not have, right? In instances where that should not be the standard, right? So all of those things are packaged inside of a use of force bill that is HB 139. The fourth thing is that we have to, our fourth priority is to return the Baltimore City Police Department to local control. And so what this essentially means is that BPD is right now, its policies, its top line policies are regulated by the state, right? So if we wanted to, let's say, redraw the police districts, we would have to go through the state in order to redraw the police districts, because the census just happened and there's different populations of people throughout the city, and some have increased and some have decreased, right? What we know to be true is that we should not have white legislators from Frederick County deciding the policy of the Baltimore City Police Department, because they don't have the context, right? They don't have the local context, and frankly, they probably don't have the correct political analysis to be able to make a sound decision on what policies should be implemented and forced onto the Baltimore City Police Department. And we believe that this is just racist because we are the only police department in the state of Maryland that does not control its police force, right? And so what you end up having is the Baltimore City Council, who is perfectly positioned to say what the residents and what the community members of Baltimore City needs, but they have no actual authority to implement those needs. And then there's, of course, naturally questions around the Baltimore City consent decree, because we know Baltimore City Police Department has a pattern and practice of engaging in racist, unconstitutional policing, right? And so the Baltimore City Council has no authority to hold them accountable and to make sure that they actually fully implement the consent decree or any type of policing reforms that would make for a more just, more equitable, more safe police department in Baltimore City. And so that bill is also being sponsored by Senator Carter in the Senate, and it is HB 670 in the House. And then finally, the last bill is removing police from schools. So this, I don't know why this is such a controversial bill. I'll just say, like, honestly, I feel like this is one of, out of all of these, the one that makes the most sense. Because we know that when police officers are in particularly predominantly Black schools, they have a tendency to be more aggressive than any other school district. And we know when we walk into predominantly white school districts, like in Howard County, we don't see police officers as soon as we walk in, right? It's only disproportionately in Black communities that we essentially see police officers who engage in racist, discriminatory policing in our school system. We also know that the school to prison pipeline is furthered by police being inside schools, because you're essentially having students walk into schools that look like jails or look like correctional facilities, right? And so if that's all they know, that's essentially the only option we're giving young people to think about when they think about what should be normalized, right? And then lastly, we've seen many of cases both inside the city of Baltimore, throughout the state of Maryland, as well as throughout the country, where police are not trained in de-escalation. Police inherently are trained in escalation. And we know that we do not want young people to experience police escalation or police brutality in any way, shape, or form, especially not inside of our school systems that are supposed to be a place of learning and nurturing for young people and for their minds. And so we're calling for the complete removal of police officers from schools because it just makes sense. It just makes sense. And I see that I should be out of time now. So the last thing that I'll just say very briefly is that on all 5 of these priorities, I have a philosophy, and I think many folks agree with this, that this is the year for police reform. And if we can't get it past this year, it's probably never going to pass. Honestly, I don't know when we'll get another moment like this between the massive uprisings that we came off of during the summer, as well as the January 6th attempted coup that put on national display the disparities in the treatment that exists, but when police officers engage with white people versus when they engage with Black people and people of color, as well as the years of brutality that has existed in Baltimore City and other Black communities across the state and across the country. This is the year for police reform. And so this is the year where we need all hands on deck. This is the year where we need all of our allies, all of our community members putting pressure on the state legislature to pass not just mediocre police reform, which we know they do, pass mediocre laws, but we need bold, radical police reforms that will actually change the conditions that we find people of color and Black people living under.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Trey. I definitely want to echo something that they said about this being the year. I've heard that sentiment echoed by several delegates and senators, et cetera, who've attended some teach-ins that I've gone to. So that's a sentiment that I think is definitely something to put some stock in. So thank you for all of that wonderful information. Next, once again, we're going to hit this legislative district slide. And then we have Gabriela Roque from CASA de Maryland. She's the regional lead organizer there, and she's here to talk about CASA's legislative priorities.
Hi everyone, my name is Gabriela Roque and I'm the Central Maryland lead organizer here in CASA Baltimore. As was just said, I use she, her pronouns. I want to start off talking a little bit about myself and my role, just because I think if you know a little bit about the person who's talking, you remember a little bit more what they talked about. So, so I am a daughter of immigrants. My parents were immigrated from Guatemala in the 1980s. And like many immigrants, they said they would be here a couple years and work and then go right back to their country. My mom was only 18 at the time when she actually came to the US with my dad. They crossed the border illegally. My mom tells me some crazy stories about going through underground tunnels and being with strangers all day. But they actually landed in Los Angeles. So even though I work in Baltimore, I'm truly deep down a Cali girl. You might notice some of that, just kidding. So once I was 3, my parents moved us to Maryland because my father couldn't find work. At that time, he tells us that the poverty, the lack of jobs was so extreme that, he would pick up quarters and loose change that he would find on the street and buy me and my siblings a churro with $1 and split it between us. So there was really hard times for me and my family. And growing up, I grew up in PG County originally, where everybody there is Central American or from the African community or immigrant Black community. I didn't have any white friends until I was about 12. The only white people I knew in my life were my teachers and professionals that I knew. So it was quite the experience for me when I went from living in PG to moving to Frederick, which at that time was predominantly white. I was often the only Latina student in my classes. And that was also not the best time to move when you're in middle school and you want to fit in and then you realize you're a racial minority. So that was fun times. And then I decided to go to my community college in Frederick, and I took a sociology class, and that class, my professor completely ignited the spirit of social justice within me. Suddenly, all of these experiences that I had in my life just made sense. And I was like, oh, okay, this is racial discrimination, this is gender bias, this is this, and this is poverty, and all of this is intentional. And if we understand these systems, then we can organize together to change them. And so I decided after community college to go to Goucher. And that's right, I don't know if there's any Gophers here, but go Gophers. So I went to Goucher. That's how I ended up in Baltimore. I did a little bit of union organizing from the gate, as they say, but that didn't lead to a full-time job. And I'm a young lady who knows what she's worth. So luckily, CASA was hiring at the same time for community organizer. And for me, it really was just like my life had come full circle. CASA's office was actually only a few blocks from my childhood home in PG County. So ending back up in an immigrant Latino organization that's member-based and supports the immigrant Latino community in Maryland was such a huge moment for me. And being able to organize the community has been a huge learning experience, and something that I wish I could do more of, but now I'm essential. Now I'm the promoter or lead organizer. So I get to do the fun work of working with you guys, advocates, activists, and bringing even more people into our movement. So that's a little bit about me. That's a little bit about my story. And I have to say that, you know, working at CASA, working with all of our members, to me, it's just like a huge extended family. And so all of these issues that we fight for, you know, I feel them like truly in my heart, as if it was happening to my own family members. So I'll get a little choked up if I think too much about it, but I'm really excited to be here in this meeting with you guys, seeing over 80 people who want to support communities of color, immigrant communities. It really, you know, it's why we're here. It's why we do the work. So let's jump in. I'm sure that many of you have gone to our teach-ins and have know a little bit about something about these laws. If it's okay with you guys, I love to be interactive. So we can just start with the Trust Act. Would somebody like to tell me what they know about the Trust Act? And then I will fill in whatever is left or just add a little context to that. Oh no, people can't take themselves off mute. Well, I guess that kind of puts a hole in that. But if you write something in the chat close to what you know about the Trust Act, I will read that out loud. Sorry, that does make sense for a meeting with 80 people. In my meetings where we normally have 80 members, no one can control them. They're all off mute. So I should have known. Okay, so the Trust Act then. The Trust Act is like our all-time most important piece of legislation that we are advocating for this year. We have been fighting for the Trust Act for the last 8 years. If you already think about that timeline, you already know probably our biggest obstacle is Larry Hogan, who is not a friend of the immigrant community. So we have been working really hard to try to secure a supermajority in the General Assembly so that we can have a veto-proof Trust Act. This year, we're feeling really confident about the Trust Act because as I am told by our policy expert, Kat, it is being co-sponsored by Will Smith, who is the chair of the Judicial Committee. She would be so happy if she heard me recite that sentence. And having him support this bill puts us in a really good position to get it passed and out of committee quicker. And we are also counting on activists like you guys to call also your representatives if they are part of the Judicial Committee to tell them to support the Trust Act. The Trust Act usually is the piece of legislation where we hear a lot of, we'll say, anti-testimonies, just testimonies against the Trust Act. What the Trust Act does is officially make Maryland a sanctuary state. Right now, Maryland only has a few sanctuary cities or sanctuary counties. For example, Baltimore City is a welcoming city because, as Trey mentioned, they don't have control of their police department, so they can't actually say, no, there is no at all police collaboration with ICE. So it's a welcoming city, and in Baltimore County, we also have an executive order that makes that limits law enforcement cooperation with ICE. Even though we have this executive order, it doesn't mean that all police officers know about this executive order. It doesn't mean that they're being trained about this executive order. And even if there is local police who do not ask questions about ICE, there's always state police and other state law enforcement that can take it upon themselves to act as ICE agents. So there are some notable counties, for example, Frederick and Hartford, that also are not sanctuary counties, and in fact have contracts with ICE deputizing their local law enforcement, their sheriff, as ICE agents. So if someone who is a Baltimore County resident drives to Frederick County to visit family, let's say, and they don't come to a complete stop, and an officer witnesses that and thinks, this is a brown person, maybe they are illegal, they can go over there, they can stop you for making an incomplete stop, and at the same time ask you if you are a citizen or what your immigration status is. And if someone isn't aware of their rights or out of fear it says that they're here without proper authorization, then that can be held against them and they can be detained. They can be detained until ICE shows up and arrests them, or they could be taken to a detention center. So it's super important that we pass the Trust Act so that there is this level of protection in the whole state, and that assurance that law enforcement is not collaborating with ICE, that we are not giving our local money, our local resources to support ICE's agenda of separating families and keeping people in detention. So I don't know if there's any questions about the Trust Act. Since you cannot speak, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and I will respond to them. And I'll keep it chugging. Well, I want to give you guys maybe like a testimony of the Trust Act, a case to kind of help you think about a situation where this has actually happened to somebody. So we had one of our members testify in one of our lobby nights. She was actually a resident in South Baltimore. And one day she decides to call the police because someone had robbed her car. So she called the police to report the robbery. And initially, she didn't even want to call the police. She was feeling iffy about it, but since her house had been robbed before, she was worried about this becoming a pattern. So reluctantly, she called the police. And when the police showed up, the first thing the police did was ask her for her driver's license. And people who have a driver's license without a social security number have one that's marked and says not for federal use. So the police officer, after seeing her driver's license, asked her about her immigration status, even though he's not supposed to, and begins questioning her. And she says, like, that person who was supposed to come here and help me started to investigate me and started to treat me like the criminal. And she didn't know what to do. She was there answering the police officer's questions. He claimed that he made a report about the robbery, but then just went on telling her that she couldn't go back inside her home and she couldn't leave either. And he was calling ICE. And within 40 minutes, ICE showed up at her place and she ran indoors, locked the doors so that she could escape from being detained. But even though she got away that time, ICE ever since then was watching her home. So she had to move she had to move where she was living because fear of ICE following her and knowing where she lived. So she had to relocate. And then a few months later, since her car was stolen and never recovered, she was driving a broken down car. And this car actually ended up becoming, catching on fire. The engine caught on fire on the highway. And she did not call the police, but the tow truck person called the police. And when the police arrived, saw that she had a warrant, like a civil warrant, which immigrants who maybe failed to go to their first court hearing or whatever the case may be might have a warrant for not showing up for their initial court case. So seeing that warrant, he calls ICE again and holds her there on the highway for 2 hours until ICE shows up. She gets separated from her 10-year-old daughter, her 13-year-old son, her 22-year-old daughter who has a newborn, her marriage ends because of the deportation that eventually happens. And her daughter is suffering now from anxiety attacks. It's a truly heartbreaking story. And none of this needed to happen. This police officer who took it upon himself to call ICE because someone had robbed her car, that never had to happen. This person had lived in the country for 18 years, never had a criminal history, never even had a traffic violation. So these are the reason, well, this is just one case of many people who were unjustly transferred to ICE. And because of this, separated from their family and their livelihoods destroyed. And this is a really shocking case, but there are even worse case scenarios where someone is deported, and obviously these countries are unsafe, otherwise people wouldn't be fleeing from them. And after being deported, they're murdered. So some of these cases can even lead to people dying. So that's the Trust Act. It's hard to make a transition from that. But that's the Trust Act, and we hope that you guys can help us tell the story as well, that no one needs, law enforcement doesn't need to act as ICE agents. We don't need to support this agenda. We don't need to invest our own resources in this type of work. And what we want is to make sure all residents feel confident in calling the police and having their issues resolved. Okay, dignity, not detention. So this bill would ban private detention centers here in Maryland. Maryland actually does have, thank you. Maryland actually does have a bill already prohibiting private jails, for-profit prisons, and this would just extend it to also include detention centers. And this bill really came about because we realized that ICE was creating contracts with local detention centers. So in Howard County, for example, we had a campaign to try to close the Howard County Detention Center because the Howard County government entered into a contract with ICE, whereby every person that ICE had detained in their detention center for immigration reasons, the county was making $110 a day per person. So just one person detained there for, let's say, like 5 days is already $500 for the county government. So they were making millions of dollars off of keeping people detained. And they were not doing any work whatsoever to verify why these people were actually detained. They weren't saying, they were taking ICE's word completely, for granted that the people who they were detaining for legitimate reasons. When we know that actually ICE has a quota and has their own agenda of just, not prioritizing anyone can be a target. And they were detaining people who had no reason to be in detention or who had never had an immigration proceeding before, but just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And no amount of detention can be justified. We had an instance in Howard County where someone was detained because he was borrowing another person's car. So ICE had detained this person thinking that they were someone else, didn't ask them for their ID, or if they did, they didn't care that he wasn't the person who they were looking for, detained him anyway. And he was a single father. He was on his way home. He had no way of picking up his kids from work, of telling anybody where he was. And this happened. He wasn't able to contact anybody for at least a day and figure out what he could do with his children. So these disruptions, they're just unjust, and the people who really suffer are the families and the children. So we have the Driver Privacy Act as well. I'm trying to do these a little bit quicker now because I noticed that I'm kind of gabbing a lot. So the Driver Privacy Act, this is really to take back a win from our community. We were successful in getting driver's license for undocumented immigrants. So people who didn't have a social security number but had a tax ID number could use that to apply for a driver's license. And this was a huge progressive win in Maryland. There are very few states in the US who have this option for immigrants. So the fact that we had this completely transformed people's lives. They were able to buy cars, they were able to get better jobs, they didn't have to rely on public transportation, they didn't have to rely on public transportation for emergencies. And this just opened obviously many opportunities for them. What we never expected to happen with this bill is that it would be used to support ICE enforcement, ICE's enforcement mechanisms. So what ICE can do is use state database agencies, so the NBA driver's license database, and they can actually go through the entire database and match people's pictures, their names, their date of birth, and find where they live, find their current address on their using their driver's license. And ICE was doing this so much that we noticed this trend. CASA was responding to many detentions in the area, many raids in the area, and the thing that they all had in common was someone had recently gotten their driver's license. And one case was so apparent that they had used the driver's license that that person got their driver's license in the afternoon, and I showed up at their door at 2 in the morning to detain them. So that's how quickly and efficiently, horribly ICE can use this information against immigrants. So what we want our legislators to do is fix this problem. This was always meant to be a benefit for the community, and the fact that now it's being used against us is just shameful. Okay, universal representation. This one is a new bill that we are supporting this year, and it's a very important one, as all of these are. So many of you, I hope that you know. If you don't know, I'll tell you now. If you are an immigrant, you are not given a free lawyer. So even though immigrants are called criminals and they're being treated like criminals, a criminal actually has more rights than an immigrant, because if a criminal is detained or accused of a crime, they are given a free lawyer if they are given a public defender if they don't have the money to hire a lawyer. That is not the case if you are an immigrant and you come into this country and you want to build a case for yourself to stay here. You have to hire your own private lawyer. And you also have to hire a private lawyer while not being legally authorized to work. And you also have to hire a private lawyer without knowing anything about the legal immigration system. So it's an impossible situation for many immigrants to try to do things the right way and try to find legal programs that they're eligible for when they have absolutely no skills, no orientation on how to do that. So what universal representation will do, if an immigrant in Maryland, a resident of Maryland who's an immigrant is detained by ICE, they will be given a free lawyer provided by the state that can defend them, help them get out of detention, and build them a case for them to stay here. And we have a program that's similar to this in the city that's called Safe City. And the statistics that Safe City has produced, when someone is detained by ICE and they have no legal representation, their chances of staying in the country are only 17%. But once they have a lawyer, their chances of staying here in the country go up to 50%. So that is how much a lawyer can make a difference. It can literally give you a 1 in 2 chance of staying here in this country versus a 1 in 5 chance. So that is universal representation. I want to say quickly things about overriding Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Has a lot of good things for ESOL students, has a lot of good things for students of color and working class students, and that is why CASA is supporting it. Access to counsel in rent court. This is also really in a similar vein to universal representation. And especially now with COVID, so many people being sued or threatened or potentially facing eviction need to have, sorry, I'm reading the notes in the chat. So what was I saying? We wanna make sure tenants have that legal counsel for the same reasons. Housing court is complicated, and for someone to even benefit from any of these federal or state protective orders, they have to know how to create this case, how to use it, how to sign the right documentation, how to provide the proof. And this is where having a lawyer can be essential, and also give someone that confidence to actually challenge their landlord and show up to court instead of simply resigning themselves and not fighting. COVID-19 Eviction and Housing Relief Act, housing justice. This is the time to make eviction harder. One thing I'll quickly say about eviction protection or reforming eviction, something that I learned doing this work, that the cost to file an eviction is only $15 here in Maryland. This is outrageous. In other places in our neighboring states, the cost of eviction to file a case for eviction is at least $100. But here, a landlord can do that for 15 bucks. And I think that is just incredibly sad and heartbreaking to think that for $15, what I spend in coffee a week, like that's all it could take to throw someone out on the street for them to lose all of their possessions and be completely thrown into instability. So that's not right. And we need to use the pressure, use the momentum of COVID to make these reforms so we can have housing justice, have legal support. Maryland Essential Workers Protection Act, I'm sure Bridge is going to say everything about this. And I want to say that CASA is also completely in support of this bill. So many of our immigrant workers are essential workers, and they have been facing this pandemic without any protection, without any hazard pay, or even assurances that they'll be protected from COVID. So with that, I will pass it back to Barbara.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. I've attended several teach-ins hosted by CASA, and they are always so informative. So anytime I have the opportunity to hear someone from CASA speak, I learn a ton. So thank you so much. I am seeing a message here to introduce Bridge. So I will make myself quiet so that actually Bridge can do that themselves.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. My name is Bridge. I'm with 1199 SEIU, United Healthcare Workers East. We are the largest healthcare workers union in the country. We have 10,000 members in Maryland alone, and our members are frontline healthcare workers. And I'm so grateful to have an opportunity to work with Chris Dews and the Job Opportunities Task Force and Gabriella Roque with CASA on this very important bill, the Maryland Essential Workers Protection Act. So I'm just going to real quick show you on my screen, and I will be as brief as possible for a subject that is so detailed. So this is essentially a Bill of Rights for essential workers. Right number one is the right to safe and hygienic working conditions, which is of course going to include making sure that all frontline workers have access to high quality PPE to keep them safe. I was speaking to one of our members today, and I asked her, how's it going with the PPE in your long-term care facility? And she told me that she was issued exactly one gown, and she had to wear it until it was literally shredded, covered in holes, completely unusable. She went to management and requested a new gown. Management's response was, That's all he said to her, as she's standing there in this gown that will not keep her safe from this virus as she's working in a nursing home. And you can see on the fact sheet here that around 56% of the deaths have occurred in long-term care facilities. So it's critically important that the healthcare workers, as well as the patients, have access to PPE. So I am just curious here, how many people, just raise your hand real quick, have heard essential workers called heroes? All of us, because they are. Now, what's the best way, one of the best ways to thank them for their work? Pay them. Hero workers deserve hero pay. So this bill would establish a hazard pay of $3 an hour to be paid out to all essential workers for the state of emergency around COVID. And it would also include opening up the Maryland Health Exchange so that they can get better healthcare assistance. Next would require all places of employment to have emergency action plans in place so that if there is another spike in COVID or a future pandemic rolls around, we're not going to have to be scrambling to figure out, where is PPE going to come from, who's getting vaccinated. So they'll all be required to submit these plans to MOSH. Next is universal health and bereavement leave. It is absolutely absurd to me that there are, even in the healthcare field, frontline workers who are getting sick and they are having to take their vacation days or take unpaid time off of work because they've gotten COVID or because a loved one has passed away from COVID. I'm very excited about this one, number 5, the right to refuse dangerous work. That means, so going back to the first example of our member who had her shredded gown and our other members who were only issued garbage bags that they had to cut holes in to put over their heads. If that worker came to work and the management said, when she requested a new gown, she would have then had the right to say, I'm not working my shift until you get me a new gown. And they would not be able to fire her or retaliate against her for refusing that dangerous work. Finally, free testing and reporting of positive results. Unfortunately, free testing is not universal for COVID, and there are a lot of essential employees who are required to get tested regularly in order to go to work. So if they are having to pay to these tests, pay to get tested to go to work, they're essentially paying to go do their job, and anything that is required of them should be free. We've also heard, coming out of hospitals and long-term care facilities and other places as well, that they are not doing a good enough job of reporting positive results. So I was speaking with another member who ended up getting sick of COVID, and she found out that her coworker who had worked the same shift had it, but no one from management alerted her that she had worked a shift with someone who had tested positive for COVID. So these are all, if anyone's got questions about that, I'm happy to follow up later. I do want to be aware of my time here, but I will say something that you can do to really help with this is attend next week, 1199, in partnership with CASA and in partnership with Job Opportunities Task Force and like the 45 other organizations who are pushing for this bill are having a lobby day. It's virtual. It's on Wednesday and Thursday from 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. In addition to the Maryland Essential Workers Protection Act, we will also be lobbying on the police reform package that Trey presented on earlier. We'll be lobbying on the veto override for Blueprint for Maryland's Future. So a lot of these bills that you've heard about today, this will be an opportunity for you to actually get in front of legislators and lobby. So I hope that you all can join us. I put the sign up link, it's a Mobilize link in the chat. And thank you so much.
Yay, thank you so much, Bridge. That's awesome. A ton of great information. Sorry, I'm going to get my screen share set up again. It's going to take me a hot second. Present. Well, we're going to have to flip through some slides. All right. I know I saw the chat blowing up. Folks are being very generous with their donations and matching each other, and that's awesome. I know that we far exceeded our goal, but here's the link. Again, if anyone wants to throw a few more bones in there, that would be great.